I'm Ed Hickey, President of the American Association of Kidney Patients. We've had two fantastic panel discussions so far, and we'll keep the discussion going today on transplantation with our next panel discussion, Transplantation and Transformation Unfolds Across America's Transplant System, Opportunities and Risks to Closely Watch. The transplant system is a public-private partnership between the federal government and the transplant community, and it's designed in part to prevent overt political influence and other governmental interference in shared patient-physician decision-making and clinical judgment. AAKP believes that improvements to the transplant system can best be made through ethically and legally sound, evidence-based, data-driven policies informed and guided by patients and transplant professionals rather than by overhauling the entire transplant system. In the midst of a presidential transition, AAKP will closely be monitoring the details of this transformation and advocacy for full transparency throughout this process. To speak about this issue, AAKP has called upon two allied partners. Providing remarks first will be Dr. Matthew Cooper, Chief of Division of Transplantation at the Medical College of Wisconsin, Director of the Joint Solid Organ Transplantation Program at Froedtert Health and Children's Hospital in Wisconsin, and past President of the United Network of Organ Sharing. Unfortunately, Dr. Cooper couldn't be with us today, so we're honored to grab some time earlier in the week for him to capture his thoughts. Please turn your attention to the screen.
Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Matthew Cooper. I'm the Chief of Transplant in the Medical College of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. I am privileged really to be here today. I want to thank the AAKP for this opportunity. Sincerely want to thank Mr. Ed Hickey for the introduction. We have worked on opportunities in the past, and I'm very pleased to be a part of this with him today. And my thanks to Paul Conway, who, again, I've had the privilege of knowing for a good 20 years of my career. And he and I have walked shoulder to shoulder on a lot of really important opportunities in policy and making sure that the patient needs are always first. And so I'm again really privileged to be here to present a topic that's very important to me. I'm going to try and focus on three major issues here during the course of my time here. I've been involved in the OPTN pretty much again most of my career, and I'm very proud of the fact that I served as the OPTN president back in 2021. It was really an amazing ability to be able to see how policy is constructed, how we continue to try and provide more opportunities for patients that need an answer better than end-stage organ failure, and particularly see the partnering with our federal agencies. And I think we still need some opportunities to improve that. The thing that certainly where it's focused on in the last year or so is in the HRSA Modernization Initiative. Again, I was part of this as it began, and I've continued to follow it very closely. I'm not sure whether the new administration is going to change some of this, but we'll see. But the Modernization Act, I think, has, again, a lot of opportunities, particularly in abilities to provide more funding for the OPTN. Most folks don't know that previous to this, the majority of the funding to be able to perform the operations of the OPTN were through donor registrations and through transplant programs, getting their patients on the list. And now federal appropriations are close to 3 or 4 times what they were before, at least approved to be that much. And so I'm excited to see what that could bring on. Essentially what the focus areas are on this slide here, looking at tech and trying to improve analytics and the data with which decisions are made, certainly the governance and operations, and the ability to really provide sort of first-in-class kind of opportunities is really where we're hoping to take this, appreciating that the OPTN doesn't need to do everything themselves, but again, focused on transparency. I'll add to the words on the slides, but also continue to look at equity and accountability and performance of the national system. Really what it was maybe an important sort of piece in time was in September of last year, the president signed the Security in the U.S. Procurement and Transplantation Act into law, which again, as I said, increased the appropriations for transplant. Interestingly, and again, a moment for pause was it split the current OPTN contract, which at that time and currently still exists in the hands of UNOS, which I'm always troubled when we call that a monopoly. Yes, UNOS has held the contract since 1986, but that was really how the government designed the contract. Anybody could have, and some did apply, but the fact that we're now splitting this into multiple contracts is something that we have to, I think, be cautious about. And so I'll leave it there, and we'll come back to that. If you look at kind of the first phases of this, now, again, this is perhaps old news for many in the audience, but still something important to talk about. We're going to engage stakeholders. We're going to collaborate with industry, and we're going to look at how HRSA themselves are going to try and increase the capacity to do more work and working with additional providers and additional consultants. We're going to try and add some more data, to make better informed decisions and to look at potentially moving the OPTN in a different direction. We're going to, as I said, importantly, secure more funding to be able to run the OPTN, which, again, I would have wished would have been done well prior to this. But the part that is concerning to me, and one that we have to keep in mind, is now moving forward, rather than not-for-profit organizations that are going to be participating in the OPTN, we now have for-profit organizations that are going to be part of this conversation. A critical effort that was, again, something that was, quite frankly, I think made more a deal than it was that there has been a change to the OPTN board. It's now separate from the contractor board, which allows to, I think, the public, and anybody who is, part of the system to then feel more comfortable that there's no conflict of interest between the two. This new board that currently exists with the OPTN, there's a suggestion that we will be changing that. One of the first contracts that was awarded was to the American Institute for Research, which is really providing the board support. And again, one of the first things that this contractor was tasked to do was to reseat an entire new OPTN board. That makes me a little bit nervous. Note in the final rule still exists, and note in the final rule say that the board is to be composed, the nominating committee specifically, of board of directors. And the question of how we're going to seat this new board is something with which I think we have to remain laser focused upon to assure that the board members are members of our community who understand the implications of the decisions that we make. The next steps are on this slide. An executive director, a temporary executive director, has been chosen. I expect that announcement is going to come out in the new year. There have been, again, new transition operations contracts that cover a variety of portions of the OPTN contract as it existed once as a whole. And you can see on the slide some of the things that it will change, and it will focus on things like the IT modernization, things like improving patient safety, strengthening communications to patients, and even improving the financial management. And again, I want folks to look at this part very carefully and make sure that we are continuing to assure that this potentially new election for OPTN members is by the members themselves. And so I ask everybody to keep on guard as we move forward for this as to how this practice is going to happen. This is the pieces of that transition contracts that I talked about. Again, my fear is that we now have a lot of additional contractors, and some of the challenges that existed between HRSA and the single contractor was one thing, but as we add more contractors into the mix, we're going to have to see how that works out. There's going to need to be an assurance that everyone's going to sort of play well in the sandbox so that we can assure the OPTN moves forward and not moves backward. These are those 15 contractors who have been awarded the opportunity to continue to participate in the plan going forward. And some of those you may recognize. You'll see UNOS is on that list, and there's others that you may have some contact with, but there's a lot of sort of new entities that are before us that many of us have never had any contact. And I use this sort of tongue in cheek. It's a little bit of an example of lots of cooks in the kitchen. And we all have to make sure that we are focused on the single most important thing, is assuring that our efforts are always looking at how we can promise more potential opportunities for patients. That's who we serve, are the patients, and not each other, and certainly not the contractors. Not many of these for-profit contractors that, like I've said before, have stakeholders and have boards that they need to answer to as well. The other piece that I think is important to appreciate is a current bill that is gaining some momentum, I think inappropriately named the End Kidney Deaths Act, HR 9275. And the question is around, are we at a place where we really want to talk about paying for organs? I realize that this is perhaps well-intended, led by previous living donors, but my concern is that we perhaps aren't recognizing the downside potential effects to this. I'll call a recent article that myself and really several leaders in the field have published most recently in the Journal of Transplantation. And you can see there's a lot of sort of important things that this article has called for, not only rejecting the Ending Kidney Deaths Act, but focusing on two very important things, which are increasing opportunities through NALDAC, and for gosh sake, we have to pass the Living Donor Protection Act. I believe a friend and partner of mine, Peggy Tai, who works with the ASTS, is going to be talking more about this. But there's a lot of things that we should do to remove disincentives rather than thinking about incentivize living donation. Again, I think the slippery slope to that is really concerning to me. And I think there are a number of organizations that are not looking at this the right way and or are influencing this in a profoundly challenging and concerning way. Groups like Organize and Waitlist Zero, I'm not certain are giving the proper message. This is paying individuals a sum of $50,000 to donate their kidneys. And I just think that risk is way too high and the slippery slope is way too real. And I say the idea of just changing NOTA as a Pandora's box that we do not want to open without recognizing the significant complications that could exist. And the final thing is there have been a lot of things that have been proposed around payment models that, again, seem great. The current one that's at play is the Improving Organ Transplant Access Rule, IOTA. It was planned to go in effect in January. It's now put on halt, and this only affects transplant centers. And I don't think it's important to focus tremendously on all of the specifics of this, but I think what's important to recognize is that it is well intended. And why do I say that? Because there's a lot of well-intended ideas out there that unfortunately never seem to reach their potential. Things like the End-Stage Alerting Congress and Conference that we are currently a part of that have really tried to figure out ways in which we could use more marginal organs and many other previous payment models. But this one specifically focused around transplants that are surprisingly never really involved conversations with transplant programs. And would they be able to achieve these goals and these expectations? And I'll tell you, the financial implications are really marginal, almost minimal when it comes to federal dollars. And so I'm not convinced that this actually is neither a carrot nor a stick for transplant programs and potentially just puts us in a place that continues to say we're doing something and not doing the right thing. There is a group that I'm really encouraged about, a group called OTAG that is a combination of CMS and HRSA that it's intended to work together to think more collaboratively about how we can find answers across both organizations. But I've yet to see an output from that group. And I think while it has tremendous intentions, I'd like to begin to see that we have some work product when those teams get together. Just a minute or two of soapbox, and I hope you'll forgive me, but at the same time recognize the importance. I want folks to recognize, be careful what you read in the paper. It's not always true. It doesn't have all the facts. And quite frankly, I think the sensationalism that goes on in our industry has had a significant problem on the patients that we look to serve and the donors with which all transplants are dependent upon. We are losing that public trust. And again, some of these things that I just can't begin to imagine have been published and been accepted as truths because, as said on the slide, only believe half of what you see and nothing that you hear. We can't think that the courts are the answer. We can't sue one another and bring into the public eye this concern that we can't work well together. No, we can't look at this as moving forward as the way in which we are going to solve any disputes within the OPTN. And finally, I'll say, let's never think that bringing Congress into this conversation is going to make things better. Transplant cannot be a political battleground. We cannot politicize. We cannot let lobbyists. We certainly can't let politicians decide how we, the experts, move forward with a transplant. And so we have to do everything we can to make sure that the decision-making remains in our hands and not, in Congress. Again, so I want to thank you for this opportunity. I have lots of ideas, and I certainly would be interested in speaking to anyone who has either similar or even different ideas than I had on these topics. But again, I really appreciate the opportunity to present and to work with the AAKP. They have been way out in front with a lot of things that we've talked about today. I think my message to individuals either in the audience or who are continuing to be interested in these topics, continue to volunteer, continue to make sure that your voice is heard, and continue to assure that we are putting patients first. I personally will continue to my role in advocacy and in sitting before anyone who certainly looks to make the system better. We are only as good as the sum of our parts, and we have to stop pointing fingers at one another. We have to stop saying it's someone else's problem. and it's someone else has to find the answers. We have to be the answers ourselves. So again, thank you for the opportunity.
Wonderful. Well, we appreciate Dr. Cooper's remarks, and we have a copy of his article posted on our website if anyone's interested in viewing it. And I have the pleasure now of introducing our next speaker, a very good friend and ally of AAKP, Dr. Stephen Potter. Dr. Potter is a professor of surgery and urology and a director of Pancreas Transplantation at MedStar Georgetown Transplant Institute at Georgetown University School of Medicine. Dr. Potter is the current chair of the American Society of Transplant Surgeons Surgical Policy Assessment Committee and vice chair of the OPTN Operations and Safety Committee. Dr. Potter, thank you very much for joining us here today in the midst of your very active transplant schedule. I would like to pose several questions to you so our audience can benefit from your insight in building off of what we just heard. Dr. Cooper just talked about altruistic donor organ donation and it being the cornerstone of American transplant system. And unfortunately, the ideas behind the legislation entitled End Kidney Deaths Act run contrary to the principles of altruism. As a transplant surgeon who works with both organ donors and their families and those awaiting an organ transplant, what is the significance of the challenge this legislation and its underlying ideas pose to the America's altruistic organ donation?
Ed, thank you so much for having me, and thanks for the great questions. It's a privilege to be here. And, you know, in addition to the opportunity to speak, I want to thank AAKP, and I want to thank you and Paul Conway for your leadership on behalf of patients over the years, and it's been an honor to work with you. So, you know, the way forward with promoting living donation is to remove the disincentives that living donors face. I do, as you mentioned, I do work every day with living donor candidates and with those desperately in need of that gift of life. And it's the most important thing I do, and it's the reason I get out of bed every day. And it's troubling to me that on almost a weekly basis, I talk to potential living donors who are concerned about the loss of insurability, they're concerned about potential job loss because of the selfless act that they want to undergo. And it's in a pragmatic world, it's absolutely true that many people who would otherwise donate an organ as living donors they feel unable to do so because of those subjective and objective concerns, and because of the kind of costs related to donation, right? The travel expenses and so forth. So it's very important that we work assiduously to decrease disincentives through protecting insurability, through protecting donors from job loss, and covering the costs of the donation. Through removing those disincentives, we can we can increase the number of living donors that come forward and are able to donate in this country. Now let's talk about the bill in question, which is the End Kidney Deaths Act. This is a well-intentioned bill, I'm sure. I'm gonna assume that it's that the writers of this bill have the best of intentions. But this bill has the potential to absolutely destroy living donation in this country. I don't want to understate it. And the reason for that is that when you provide a financial incentive, by definition, you are marginalizing the most vulnerable among us. So you're not going to have a lawyer and a partner in a law firm come forward to donate a kidney for $50,000 refundable tax credit. But you will have Uber drivers coming forward to do it. And I don't think that's right. But we also have to remember that it's not just the impact of paying and how ethically unsound that is, but you have to remember that when we start to pay people to donate organs, the people who are doing it now without paying will suddenly disappear. And we've seen that in other countries that have instituted a pay-for-organ scheme, and we've seen it in parallels in the United States. When we changed the allocation system to provide more incentive for particular groups of recipients to get deceased donor organs, their living donors don't come forward as readily. So I'm fairly confident that a bill like this, if enacted, would not have the intended effect of improving living donation, and in fact would have the unintended consequence of destroying living donation.
Thank you. And you mentioned insurability as well. And for over a decade, really now. It's incredible that AAKP and the American Society of Transplant Surgeons have worked together to gain congressional support for the Living Donor Protection Act. Can you give us some insight as a transplant surgeon on the front lines of kidney care about the need for this legislation and your thoughts on where it stands now and the strategic importance of keeping up the fight for this legislation?
Sure, that's a great question, Ed. So, you know, it's funny, it's a small world because yesterday I took a kidney out of a living donor and I sent it to DCA and it got on a plane, it went to Milwaukee, and my old friend Dr. Cooper transplanted that kidney last night. So it's really a small world we live in. And everyone's doing well, and that's what's most important. That's why we're all here today, right, to help these patients. The Living Donor Protection Act is exactly the type of thing that we need to work on. And the reason is that it effectively addresses those disincentives to donation by protecting living donors with that selfless act. It would put into law the FMLA protections that are currently present, but only in the regulatory space, and it would provide additional protections for living donors. So, you know, you're going to hear more about the LDPA today from a real expert in a different world, like not a transplant surgeon, but a legal and legislative expert, Peggy Tai. So she'll speak later today about some of the details. But I can tell you that the LDPA has 220 congressional signatories right now, and there are 43 sign-ons in the Senate. So it has really impressive bicameral and bipartisan support, and it has a CBO score of 0. So this is a cost-effective solution with broad support, and I'm hopeful that we can get this passed into law in the near future.
And importantly, the life insurance industry supports it as well. So
that's absolutely true, and we've worked for the last year and a half to make some subtle tweaks to the language in the bill to get the life insurance companies on board.
Right, that's great. And then a final question for you. Over the past 18 months, many changes have been proposed to the transplant system, and these include the OPTN modernization under HHS, Health Resources and Service Administration, HRSA. And can you tell us the key issues you are watching for within OPTN, particularly given your role in the modernization implementation, and what patient advocates like AAKP, industry and professionals like those in the room should keep a close eye on as HRSA moves forward?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one where you can easily go down a rabbit hole into the arcane and obtuse. But you know, I would say let's keep in mind what we're all here for: patients, and remember that there are about 100,000 people on the waiting list right now for organs, and about 20 of them dying every day waiting. And we're all working very hard to improve the number of transplants done. In fact, we've dramatically improved the number of transplants done every year for a decade in this country. So there's a lot to celebrate, but we need to do better. Changing the OPTN, changing the transplant system is kind of like changing the engines on an aircraft while you're flying at 30,000 feet. And the passengers on the plane are those 100,000 people that are on the waiting list. So I think we have to be, in very simple terms, we just have to be cognizant of that and keep patient safety at the forefront. I can speak as someone deeply involved in the American Society of Transplant Surgeons that we have worked very hard to collaborate and partner with HRSA, that we are supportive of the modernization effort. And I think that in the years to come, thanks to HRSA's involvement and thanks to this modernization effort, we will be in a better place than we are now. I'm confident of that, but I'm worried that the journey will have a lot of turbulence as we change out those engines and change our policies and protocols. I would echo Dr. Cooper's concerns. We have to be very cognizant of transparency and governance. We want to make sure that the changes are following rules of good governance. We want to make sure that there is an independent OPTN board, and that the members of that board are elected and not appointed. And then we have really some serious concerns about how the different contractors are going to be managed and are going to interrelate with each other and with the board, because there's not a clear explication of how the system will be managed, and it's a very complex system with a lot of moving parts.
And I'd like to put in a personal plug for patients to be on that board as well and not excluded. So. And
you just pointed out, thank you very much, Ed, because I think that was implied in my comments, but not specifically stated enough. So the OPTN, one of its great successes has been the intrinsic involvement of transplant professionals, donor families, patients, and prior living donors. And along with OPO folks, HLA folks, people from all over the transplant community. And they're not just holding up their hands to vote, or they're not just expressing an opinion. They're intimately involved in the development of policy, the vetting of those policies, and the monitoring of transplant programs and OPOs. So we have to make sure that that machinery that includes over 600 volunteers from across the transplant ecosystem is part of the new system, because that's what allows the successes that we've had.
All right. Thank you, Steve. As we reach the end of our time for this discussion, I'd like to again thank Dr. Cooper and Dr. Potter for weighing in on this topic. AAKP is fully aligned with the most impactful and leading transplant professionals in the kidney space, and we share a common commitment to making sure any changes to the transplant system are in the best interest of the patient, organ donors, and the American taxpayer.